In March of 1296, one of the most brutal and defining events in medieval Anglo-Scottish history unfolded with the sacking of Berwick-upon-Tweed by Edward I of England. This chilling episode marked not only the beginning of the First War of Scottish Independence, but also served as a dire warning of the brutal campaigns to follow. Edward's calculated assault on Berwick was far more than a simple military maneuver. It was an intentional show of unrelenting force, a symbolic act of dominance intended to crush Scottish morale and resistance before it could fully take shape. Berwick-upon-Tweed was more than just another town on the map. Perched strategically at the mouth of the River Tweed on the eastern coast of Great Britain, it was the most prosperous settlement in Scotland during the late 13th century. Berwick thrived as a bustling port and commercial centre, boasting vibrant trade with Flanders, France, and other European regions. The town's economic vitality made it an enticing target for Edward's forces, while its proximity to the English border made it the ideal launching point for a northern campaign into the Scottish heartland. By seizing Berwick, Edward could secure a strategic beachhead, cripple the Scottish economy, and send a message that English power was swift and merciless. The roots of this catastrophic conflict were buried deep in a tangled web of dynastic uncertainty, political maneuvering, and long-standing tensions between the English and the Scots. The death of Alexander III of Scotland in 1286, followed shortly thereafter by the death of his heir, Margaret, Maid of Norway, left Scotland in a precarious state without a clear successor to the throne. This period of instability, known as the Great Cause, saw multiple claimants emerge to contest the Scottish crown. Desperate to avoid civil war, the Scots turned to Edward I for arbitration. He chose John Balliol in 1292, but not without conditions. Edward demanded, and expected, fealty. Rather than acting as an impartial mediator, Edward used the opportunity to assert his overlordship and reduce the newly crowned Balliol to a puppet monarch. Balliol, however, proved reluctant to play this subordinate role. Chafing under Edward's interference, he attempted to assert his independence, most notably through an alliance with France, England's traditional enemy. This defiance, perceived by Edward as both a betrayal and a threat, triggered the English invasion of Scotland in 1296. With a well-equipped and experienced army at his back, Edward crossed the Tweed and began his campaign with a vengeance. Berwick, as the richest and most prominent town in Scotland, became his first and most important target. Despite its wealth and prominence, Berwick was poorly defended. Though the town had modest fortifications, it lacked the manpower and resources needed to repel a full-scale assault from Edward's seasoned forces. Edward issued an ultimatum: surrender and be spared. The townspeople, believing their position defensible and bolstered by patriotic zeal, refused. In response, Edward unleashed his army upon the town, initiating one of the bloodiest massacres in medieval British history. The assault was swift, devastating, and merciless. English soldiers stormed Berwick's walls with brutal efficiency. Once the defences were breached, they poured into the streets, killing indiscriminately. No quarter was given. According to both contemporary and later chroniclers, men, women, and children were slain in mass. Entire families were cut down in their homes. The carnage even spilled into churches, where those seeking sanctuary were shown no mercy. Some reports claim as many as 7,500 were killed, a figure likely inflated by chroniclers aiming for dramatic effect, but the true death toll was still horrifyingly high. Even by the standards of medieval warfare, where civilians were often collateral damage, the sacking of Berwick was exceptional in its savagery. The psychological impact of the massacre was profound. Edward's goal was to terrorize the Scots into compliance, and Berwick became a warning etched in blood. Word of the slaughter spread quickly across the land, demoralizing many and encouraging others to capitulate without a fight. The once vibrant town was reduced to rubble, its economy obliterated, its population decimated. Survivors were left traumatized, and neighboring regions shuddered in fear of what might come next. After the bloodshed, Edward did not simply abandon the town. He installed a garrison to ensure control, solidifying Berwick as a key English stronghold on Scottish soil. From there, he marched further into Scotland, dismantling resistance and deposing John Balliol with humiliating swiftness. Balliol was captured, stripped of his royal insignia in a theatrical ceremony, and imprisoned. Yet while Edward believed he had crushed Scottish independence, the truth was quite the opposite. His brutality, particularly at Berwick, planted the seeds of rebellion. Far from cowing the Scots into submission, Edward's actions ignited a fierce and enduring resistance. Among the most famous figures to emerge from the ashes of Berwick was William Wallace, who would lead a guerrilla-style uprising that captured the imagination and support of many Scots. Later, Robert the Bruce would take up the cause, leading Scotland to a series of victories and ultimately achieving a measure of independence. The sack of Berwick became a rallying point for Scottish nationalism, a symbol of both suffering and resistance that would be invoked for generations. The long-term consequences for Berwick itself were devastating. Though the town was eventually rebuilt and fortified by the English, it never regained the economic prominence it once held. The trauma of 1296 remained woven into the town's fabric, influencing its identity and role for centuries. Berwick changed hands multiple times in the following wars, becoming the most frequently contested town in British history. Its location made it both valuable and vulnerable, a prize to be fought over again and again. Edward's campaign in Scotland mirrored his earlier conquest of Wales, where he had similarly used overwhelming military force and the construction of formidable castles to assert control. But while the Welsh resistance had been gradually subdued, the Scots were far more tenacious. Scotland's decentralized clan system, rugged terrain, and strong sense of national identity all contributed to a resistance that would stretch over decades. Edward underestimated the Scottish spirit and overestimated the impact of terror as a strategy. The sacking of Berwick also reveals much about medieval warfare and political ideology. In an era where rulers derived legitimacy through conquest and divine right, acts of overwhelming violence were not only tolerated but often celebrated. Civilians were frequently caught in the crossfire, and massacres were used as tools of policy. Edward's contemporaries recorded the attack with a mix of awe and horror, and the event took on legendary proportions in both English and Scottish chronicles. For the English, it demonstrated Edward's decisiveness and strength. For the Scots, it represented English tyranny at its worst. In the centuries following the massacre, Berwick remained a pawn in the great game between England and Scotland. It changed hands at least 13 times and was the site of numerous sieges and battles. Its strategic importance ensured that it was always in the crosshairs, but the memory of its destruction in 1296 cast a long shadow. Even today, Berwick's ambiguous identity, it is geographically in England but retains strong historical ties to Scotland, can be traced back to this turbulent era. Ultimately, the sack of Berwick-upon-Tweed in 1296 was more than a military conquest, it was a turning point in the history of the British Isles. It set in motion a war that would define the identities of two nations for centuries. It also highlighted the limits of brute force as a tool of governance. Edward I believed he could bend Scotland to his will through terror and might, but the spirit he sought to break was only strengthened by his cruelty. The legacy of Berwick is one of tragedy, but also of resilience, of a people and a nation that refused to be conquered despite overwhelming odds. Through the lens of Berwick's fall, one can examine the intricate interplay of politics, warfare, identity, and memory that shaped medieval Britain. It serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of empire and the enduring power of collective resistance. The massacre at Berwick did not end the struggle, it began it. And in that fire, Scotland found the steel to fight for its soul. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious.